Hello, and welcome to the Dissidents Podcast, where we talk about how we can strive for a world in which freedom and reason are at the forefront of all human society. This week, we are releasing the recording of a live stream as a special bonus episode. If you've missed our liberal values and practice panel discussions, here's your chance to catch up on one of them, McCarthyism in the Stacks, the State of Libraries and Librarianship. If you want to listen to more like this, check out the links in the show notes or visit ilvalues.org. Hello, welcome to McCarthyism in the Stacks with panelists Pamela Hayes-Bohanan, Carolyn Nappo, and Sara Hartman-Caverly. Just a couple housekeeping things before we get started. Welcome to everyone thank you for joining us on Circle. This will be put on YouTube, but joining us on Circle helps us build our network, and it also allows you to ask questions during this event. So again, thanks for joining. Second housekeeping thing before we get started, the views expressed by the panelists, the facilitators, any participants are their own, and they do not represent those of others, including their employers, affiliates, or even the Institute for Liberal Values. So before we get started with any of the questions, I would like to invite each of you to briefly introduce yourselves. Can we start with Pam?
Hello, I'm Pam Hayes-Bohanan. I'm a soon-to-be retired reference and instruction librarian at Bridgewater State University in Massachusetts. After a almost 30-year career, I'll be wrapping it up, but I'll continue my interests in information literacy and censorship.
Thank you. Can we do Caroline next?
And I'm based in Champaign, Illinois. And hello to you too. And I have been studying, teaching, and researching libraries and the history of information institutions for about 15 years. So I do not have a library affiliation, but I am very passionate about library issues and talking about them.
And last but not least, Sara.
Thank you so much. My name is Sara Hartman-Caverly. I'm a reference and instruction librarian at Penn State Berks, which is a regional campus of Penn State University outside of Reading, Pennsylvania, kind of in rural Southeast PA. And I'm a former committee chair for the American Library Association's Intellectual Freedom Roundtable. I'm also a former contributor to the ILA Office of Intellectual Freedom's blog. I'm currently the co-moderator of Heterodox Libraries, a disciplinary community of Heterodox Academy, and I'm a contributor to our blog, Heterodoxy in the Stacks, which you can find on Substack.
Okay, well, we're all busy, but Sara sounds the busiest of them all. So we did name this panel McCarthyism in the Stacks, in part because we're seeing the term McCarthyism appear in popular press quite a bit recently. So I just want to, this is going to be kind of a long preamble to the first question, so bear with me. McCarthyism is named for Senator Joe McCarthy, who's known as the instigator of the Red Scare against communism in the 1950s. His very public and aggressive tactics regarding disloyalty, or subversion accusations resulted in the loss of livelihood, reputational damage, and the prosecution of U.S. citizens. The term McCarthyism has come to mean the use of unfair investigatory or accusatory methods to suppress opposition. So with that lengthy preamble, do you see aspects of McCarthyism in your library work today, in journals, in your professional organizations, and feel free again to, alter that definition or make your own caveats if necessary. Can we start with Caroline?
Apply McCarthyism really elastically, then we can certainly see parallels at the state level. There have been a number of incidents, and they've accelerated over the past couple of years, where state level bodies have been investigating libraries and the library associations, the library agencies, and I have certainly had a chilling effect on library work. And so I think if we take that McCarthyism as generally an air of repression that is enacted by state bodies, then yes, that would be accurate. But I think it's also important to think about McCarthyism specifically as a federal level endeavor, and we don't have that parallel. The challenges to libraries are happening in their communities locally, and then also within the states. And at the federal level, we haven't had that same kind of attack on libraries. I think optimistically, if we wanted to see a hopeful conclusion to the current attacks on libraries, then maybe they would end the same way McCarthyism did in the hearings, where once these hearings were conducted live and exposed to criticism, that they could not withstand that scrutiny. And I would like to think that the current state of affairs, where there are different groups talking past one another, libraries, I think, are part of a proxy war of larger culture war issues and political factionalism in the United States, that if there could be some genuine dialogue and where we could actually have some discussion where we can state what our beliefs are and what our goals are, then we might be able to break past this impasse. But it seems right now there's just a lot of signaling and threatening.
Caroline, could we go to you next?
Oh, Caroline just spoke, but could I actually or build on some of the things that Caroline mentioned in her initial response? So
yes, I'm sorry about that. I think we mentioned before, I can only see like parts of people.
No problem. So I actually wanted to say that I think Caroline is really correct in where she left off with libraries being a site of proxy war in terms of the politicization of kind of the information environment. So one thing I did today, because I nerd out on this kind of stuff, is I wanted to look at public polling data on some of these issues. And there was a poll done, and I'm sorry, indulge me while I dig up my notes here. A poll done on whether respondents, so this was a poll done by Ipsos in May 2023 among US adults. And the question was, do you think efforts to ban certain books in schools and libraries are more about the content of the books or more about politics? 25% of respondents said that this was about the content of the books. 69% of respondents said that this was about politics. So I think that really speaks to Caroline's observation that there's something going on other than merely a concern about the books that are held and available in libraries. Now, one thing I do want to note is when the same poll had been run the year prior in 2022, 79% of respondents attributed this to politics and 15% attributed it to the content of books. So we do see a slide there, which I think is interesting. And I think the timing of these challenges is something that is worth unpacking, in my opinion. So maybe we'll get to that later. The other thing I wanted to raise, if I can, going back to this broader framing of McCarthyism, is, McCarthyism arose in the context of the Red Scare. I did, again, go back and do a little bit of research on the history since it's not something I'm super familiar with, but there was at the time a bipartisan consensus. So McCarthyism came about kind of in parallel or contemporary with the Subversive Activities Control Act of 1950, which was passed both in the US House and Senate with broad bipartisan support. It was actually sponsored by a Democrat. So you see this bipartisan support over concern about, politically subversive activities, in particular, the Communist Party of the United States undermining sort of American values, American culture, the American way of life in the broader context of the Cold War. I think if we were to look at the broader geopolitical climate and contemporary times, you have PEN America in their most recent report from earlier this month describing this as an ed scare. So again, a very clever riff on the concept of the Red Scare. And I think we also want to look at what Michael Schellenberger and other folks who have been involved in the Twitter files have dubbed the censorship industrial complex, which harkens to both the surveillance industrial complex, which was named by the ACLU back after the Edward Snowden disclosures, and of course, the military industrial complex that we know of from Eisenhower. So I think that, there are some broader geopolitical forces at play. But the thing that makes me really optimistic is that the bipartisan consensus is actually the antithesis of censorship. So when you look at public polling data, there's broad bipartisan and not unanimous, but very, very strong pluralistic consensus around the idea that the First Amendment and freedom of expression is very important, and that libraries and banning of, or challenging of library materials, really is not popular. So that's something that I hope will give us hope, and that I think is possibly different from what folks would have experienced during the McCarthy era. I'll leave it there for now.
So, Pam, what is your response either to the original question or to either Sara or?
Well, I've been thinking about the issue of self-censorship during McCarthyism, where people just wouldn't express certain views for fear that they would be persecuted. And we know that there's been this plethora of book bans in school libraries particularly, and also public libraries, that really we haven't seen it like that in academic libraries, which is good news. However, a recent report just came out with somebody, I wish I had the names, but it's a very recent report. You can probably find it. Some people interviewed academic library leaders about what was going on in their libraries, and they said, no, we don't get these widespread challenges, but they mentioned this self-censorship, and what was interesting was that it was really coming from a different direction, right? So when you talk about school librarians, some will admit, yeah, well, I'm not buying certain books because I don't want people to come and challenge them, right? And they know what type of books those are. And it's almost the opposite with academic libraries. So the report mentioned that most academic libraries had a copy of Ibram Kendi's book, but a much, much smaller number of the libraries. And I want to say it was like 75% had Kendi's book, but it was something in the single digits, like 8% of the libraries had John McWhorter's Woke Racism. So the librarians are kind of self-censoring. They don't want to buy books that don't have that orthodox DEI stance. So it was an interesting juxtaposition to me. And, I will say this, I mean, just because we're not seeing widespread censorship doesn't mean it's not happening. It has happened in academic libraries that there's been challenges. And in fact, one of the other state librarians here in Massachusetts told me that she had a faculty member come to her and wanted to, someone in her discipline had been canceled. And so she requested that the library get rid of every single one of that person's books. She told them no, but it is happening, and it's really it's coming from a different direction.
So I just want to make sure that neither Caroline nor Sara wants to add anything before we move on to another question.
Eager to keep moving along. I think we've got a lot of exciting topics to cover.
I'll just, because I love illustrative examples, if anybody's interested in some of what Pam's describing happening in academic libraries, I encourage you to look at the example of Bard College and what happened in their library. This is a couple years ago, where they undertook what was called a diversity audit of the library collection, which in and of itself is not a bad thing. But they were doing it for the purpose of what they called decanonizing their collection. We also sometimes see this referred to as decolonizing the collection. So those are some practical examples that were written up in the Wall Street Journal and other outlets, if you're curious about what this kind of collection censorship may look like in the academic library context.
Thank you. So I think this is a perfect follow-up to what we were just talking about. The freedom to read statement was adopted in 1953 in response to McCarthyism. And if anybody hasn't read the freedom to read statement, they should. You can almost hear the national anthem playing in the background while you're reading it. It calls for libraries to make available the widest variety of views and expressions, including those that are unorthodox, unpopular, or considered dangerous by the majority. So that's a quote. It also indicates that we trust our citizens to make their own decisions about what to read and what to believe. Do you think that libraries, librarians, and publishers, the American Library Association, are acting in accordance with the freedom to read? And if it's okay, I'll start with Sara. I'm going to kind of like move around to who starts and who finishes.
If it's a binary choice, I'm going to say no. If I had to choose on a binary basis, I think for all the matters that we're discussing, there is definitely some. So if we go back to the Ashheim article, selection, not censorship, for example, which is supposed to kind of be a guiding principle on how we add things to the library's collection. Selection is the process of looking for positive cases and reasons to acquire a book or another material in the library. Censorship is the opposite, right? It's looking for justifications to exclude material from the library. And I think a lot of the examples we've discussed so far have fallen more on that censorship side of the process than on the selection side. The other issue, and again, I like to look at censorship in a broader kind of geopolitical context when we can, is that I think libraries were very quick to jump on the misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation bandwagon, and to try to herald ourselves as saviors of good media literacy and information literacy. Not that those habits of mind and knowledge areas and skills aren't important. But I think we should have been much more critical in who got to discern and determine what was mis, dis, or malinformation and how those terms were defined. If you're not familiar, malinformation is true facts that can be cast in a misleading context or in a context that may cause you to question trusted institutions like the government. So in other words, these are facts expressed in an opinion format, right? So I think that it was a very slippery slope for libraries to jump on that bandwagon and to also use mis, dis, and malinformation as a framework for deciding what they were going to select into the collection. I think when we get into more contested areas around gender theory and gender critical theory and gender realism, even climate realism versus climate alarmism, and a number of other areas, that there's a lot more nuance and context, and that frankly, the communities that we serve are entitled to access a lot more information and variety of viewpoints than we can really offer if we're strictly looking at our collections, our instruction, and our services through this lens of media information literacy around mis, dis, and malinformation. So I think the key word that stands out to me in that freedom to read statement is this idea of trust, that we have lost trust and faith in our publics to discern what information and viewpoint they want to receive and consume and how they're going to use it. Just because someone reads something doesn't mean they're going to believe it or act upon it, right? And as a result, I think that information institutions like libraries have lost the trust of our publics.
So Pam, can I ask you to chime in on that question?
So I'll just say I definitely like to see myself as a savior of teaching about mal, mis, and disinformation. I think a lot of people don't understand the difference. I didn't for a long time. Um, and but I see myself as a savior in that I want to teach people to trust themselves to determine which it is. Something that's happening a lot more in recent years for me as a reference librarian is that students just come, can you tell me if this is a credible resource? And they want me to tell them, and I say, look, you need to determine that based on what your research need is, what your information need is, and it's not something that, I told people, I said, I don't use the term spotting fake news. I don't use the word spotting when I talk about fake news. I use identifying only because there's a whole criteria of stuff that you need to apply. And that's what I'm teaching people. I'm teaching them to apply this criteria that includes, what do you need this information for? And trusting them to maybe learn something rather than just go to the librarian and say, can you tell me if this is a credible source? So thanks for opening that up for me. It is, I will admit it's getting harder and harder for me to trust some of the students with the information, but I still, until my last day, I will still be here trying to teach them what I can.
Caroline, can you address the freedom to read statement?
Well, I see the freedom to read statement as well as the Library Bill of Rights and similar documents as articulating principles, but also ideals that libraries and librarians are expected to live up to. And so I think that is also analogous to the American democratic experiment, and that it's complicated to allow for diverse viewpoints, but that the freedom to read statement is very clear about not encroaching on somebody's right to access information that might be deemed controversial or what in that period would have been called subversive. In the current context, where we do see that there are a cascade of challenges against books in libraries by very well organized groups that are typically coming from a more conservative standpoint. But we also see these challenges happening from more progressive left viewpoints as well. And so I think that that is why we have principles, is so that it can withstand these challenges regardless of where they come from. And that should also be the role of the American Library Association, to elevate this principle above whatever the particular issues are and whatever the controversial viewpoints might be. Because what the freedom to read statement and what the Library Bill of Rights expresses is that we should allow people to access information without coercing them or trying to prescribe to them how they should react to it. And I understand, like how Sara brought up, that there are, of course, concerns about people being inundated with so many sources of confusing or confounding or dangerous information. But that doesn't mean we have to restrict access. It's about helping people become better at evaluating those sources, not trying to restrict access to the sources themselves. So I think the freedom to read statement is still very powerful, and it still has resonance. It's a matter of rising to the challenge that it sets forth.
So Caroline kind of led us into what I'm going to choose as the next question, which is about the Blue Hill Public Library in Maine. they experienced a backlash for providing access to a book called Irreversible Damages, the transgender craze seducing our daughters. It's by a journalist, Abigail Schreier, and the book suggests that gender dysphoria is sort of almost the equivalent of a mass hysteria. The American Library Association ignored requests from the library director in the Blue Hills Public Library in Maine for assistance when left-leaning patrons requested the removal of the book. And so I want to start with Pam. Do you think this would be an example of, a McCarthy-esque kind of response by the American Library Association?
Yes. The short answer is yes. I was very troubled by that story, as you know. And right, and it goes right back to the freedom to read. I have not read that book. I have chosen not to, but I also believe that it belongs in a public library. It was a bestseller. People asked about it, and I don't know if it can cause harm because I haven't read it. I do know that, one of the things in the newspaper article, the director said somebody came to him and said, well, if a transgender, teenager reads this book and kills themselves, that's going to be on you. So this definite belief in, that this is going to cause harm, right? There's a definite belief that this book will cause harm, and that it'll be on this director's hands. It really goes back to the freedom to read, and I can't determine whether or not that book is harmful if I don't read it. I'm not going to read it, or at least I don't believe it's not on my to be read list. It's not, which is not to say, I never say never, but I do know that, in a public library, a book that people are asking about that is a bestseller should be on the shelf. And I remember, when was it, 10 years ago or so, when 50 Shades of Grey came out, and all these libraries, it was a bestseller and people were asking about it. And I did read that one. And they kept coming back to the same old, oh, well, it wasn't well written. It wasn't well written, so we didn't put it on the shelf, which is just, they were just hiding behind that, right? Because we have lots of books that aren't well written in the library. We didn't read them all. How do we know which ones are well written or not? But they all referred back to the same sentence in the book. It said something like, it was like chocolate or something, and everybody would laugh about, what bad writing this one sentence was. And I thought, you didn't read the book either. You're doing exactly the same thing that we're seeing now, which is people taking things out of context and repeating the same lines over and over again that somebody else said. Put the book on the shelf and let people decide whether or not they want to read it.
Caroline, how do you feel about this, this library director and the ALA response?
Well, we talked about McCarthyism, and I, criticized applying that too specifically, but maybe if we can move with the New England metaphor here, that it seems kind of like the Crucible and the way that Arthur Miller described the Salem witch trials as an allegory for McCarthyism. And so in communities where there are these very charged debates over the books to acquire or to remove from a collection, there seems to be a lot more heat than light. And it should be the role of a professional association such as the American Library Association to help mediate those conflicts. But I'm not sure if there has been additional follow-up at Blue Hill. I read the New York Times article, and I'm aware that at the time of the writing that it sounded like there had not been the support from the Office of Intellectual Freedom that had been requested by the library director. So I hope that that has since changed. However, this is, again, why we have principles and why we should aspire to adhere to those principles, so that regardless of what the challenge is, that we can point to the fact that we're not taking a side on the point of view. The side that we're on is the freedom to read, which is everybody's right, regardless of what their personal beliefs might be. And so the Blue Hill controversy is an example of a library trying to hold fast to these principles and really struggling to get support. And this is also part of general controversies that are unfolding globally around access to what have been termed gender critical views, and what some allege are transphobic and bigoted and therefore harmful to people who are trans or non-binary or gender non-conforming. So a related example would be what also happens around library programming. So the book challenges issue, if we focus too narrowly on challenges to books, we then miss these other instances where we also see challenges in libraries around access to ideas. And so in the Seattle Public Library in 2020, there was an event held with gender critical feminists. And this event was so controversial that the library, while agreeing to allow the event to go on in its space, it adjusted the meeting time so that it happened after regular library hours. And the library released statements clarifying that by having the event on library property, that they were not endorsing the event. But it was extremely controversial because the library was inundated with calls from people who insisted they cancel, and also for those who insisted that it should be allowed to go on. But this is just another example of how these issues are very much in communities, but they can also be lightning rods for these larger national and even international debates around which ideas should be allowed to be voiced and who should be allowed to hear them. And libraries of all places need to remain committed to allowing those access to ideas in a facilitated way, because that's what libraries also allow. It's not just making them available, but also making them available through thoughtful curation and with providing the tools for how to think about information.
Sara, do you have any, I'm sure you have insight that you want to share on this issue? It's very hot.
Sure. I think one of the things I'd like to do is juxtapose what happened in Blue Hill, Maine with another example that folks may be familiar with, which is what happened with Kathy Simpson, who was the CEO of the public library in Niagara-on-the-Lake. So the context is a little different, USA versus Canada, but I think the broader principles that we're talking about are in play. One of the things that really spoke to me in reading the New York Times piece about Blue Hill is that the entire library staff rallied around the principle of accessioning this book, which, if I recall correctly, was actually donated. So the only cost was the staff time to process and shelve the book, right? The entire library staff rallied around, the head of the library and the broader intellectual freedom principles of adding this donated book into the collection and making it available to members of their community who would choose to read it for whatever purpose to whatever ends, right? What we saw happen in Niagara-on-the-Lake was that the CEO there, Kathy Simpson, who's also associated with the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism, or FAIR in Libraries, published a piece where she advocated for viewpoint diversity and expressed a concern about what was happening in collection development practices in libraries, that they seemed to be primarily reflecting a progressive leftist liberal orthodoxy, and were systematically and probably purposefully excluding books and other materials, and as you'll see, other examples of programming that espoused other viewpoints. And for that, she had members of the public, one in particular, who wrote in editorials basically saying this library CEO is espousing far-right talking points that the Southern Poverty Law Center, or SPLC, has designated FAIR, a hate organization, and basically called for Kathy Simpson's termination. And she ultimately did lose her job. But one of the key things that came out in the reporting on that issue was that the staff expressed that they felt that there was a harm to their working relationship with Kathy because she had expressed support for intellectual freedom and viewpoint diversity, and asked for specific items to be added to the collection, ordered and processed and cataloged in the collection, that espouse non-progressive viewpoints on contemporary issues. And so if there is kind of a moral to these stories, it's the power of being united when you're in a library or an information institution as a staff behind common vision, common mission, and common principles, such as those we see espoused in the Freedom to Read Statement, the Library Bill of Rights, even the Code of Ethics, which maybe we'll talk about some of the nitty-gritties there. And that we use those as the guiding principles for how we conduct our work and how we treat each other as colleagues. So, Caroline mentioned the Crucible and the kind of witch hunt dynamic that really happened at Niagara-on-the-Lake, where essentially Kathy's staff, after I think more than a decade of leading and working with them, basically turned on her and declared their working relationship to be irrevocably broken. And that was a contributing factor, as was reported in the board's decision to terminate her position. So again, going back to being united as not just librarians broadly, but as staffs working in institutions together behind these shared principles.
So, the fifth principle of the American Library Association Code of Ethics says, we treat our coworkers and other colleagues with respect, fairness, and good faith, and advocate conditions of employment that safeguard the rights and welfare of all employees of our institutions. When the enemy is inside the house, right? When it's our own colleagues, maybe, or affiliated people, at an academic institution, other people within the institution who's doing the bullying or not acting in good faith. What can we do to assist, to back up the freedom to read, back up to, how can we protect our colleagues when the enemy may be in the house? So can I start with Caroline?
Really neat and clean answer to this because I think that is the struggle right now, is that we see evidence that within the profession that there is this polarization, that we are not in unanimous agreement around intellectual freedom, its relationship to social justice, and even the roles and responsibilities of librarians. So I think part of how, excuse me, we support each other as colleagues is by supporting one another in connecting with our communities, because it seems that is also one of the critical elements right now with the challenges and a lot of the discord that's been unfolding throughout the country. So if libraries are supposed to be embedded in their communities and responsive to their communities, then who is being represented and who is being left out? And if there are those who feel that they are being left out, they have a right to be heard. And then those who would remove items from the collection need to be involved in having these conversations around why libraries provide an array, or are supposed to provide an array of viewpoints. But I think too, because we see that there's not necessarily as much support available in all instances from these national bodies or larger organizations, that it's important for people to tap into their more locally oriented organizations. So that if it's at the state level or for library systems or for related paraprofessional organizations, because I think even just from being involved with heterodoxy in the stacks and heterodox libraries with Sara, that we see that there is a desire to connect over intellectual freedom and to recommit to that as a principle. And so we have to find these ways to find each other and to be able to speak openly about what that means to us and what that means to the profession. Because I don't think of information as something that harms people. I think that ignorance is what harms us. And when we're afraid of information, it's also the ways that we become afraid of one another. And so the ways to connect more authentically with people in our communities, and then also with ourselves as a country, is partly, I think, just being brave enough to encounter viewpoints that might not seem something that we would want to experience at first blush.
So, Pam, can I employ you to respond to this? My suspicion is you might have a few thoughts.
So I sometimes experience these bad actors, and they come from, if we're talking about, we're supposed to be advocating for good working conditions for our colleagues. I experience on many levels that doesn't happen, from people who are in administration at the university, people who are administration at the library, some of my own peers, and it is it's concerning to me because I try very hard to advocate for better working conditions for my colleagues. This is a union shop, and I try to know what is even in. There's 3 different unions that are working. That people in people in this library are represented by 3 different unions, depending on what their job is. And I try to have some basic familiarity with what's in each of their contracts, so that I can let them know, like, no, what somebody just did to you is something grievable, and or I'll just say, a couple years ago, right as we were coming back from the pandemic, we had a mold crisis in the library. We hadn't been here for a year and a half, and suddenly it was so urgent that we show up back at work when there's mold in the building. Like, just wait a couple more weeks and take care of the freaking mold, and I spoke right up to the president of the university about it. And I saw that as like, yeah, I have to advocate for better working conditions for everyone here. That is part of the ethical principle here. And I'll just say that president of the university kind of just nodded his head, and and I don't know what to do about that. Like, what my ultimately, I find that I'm gonna, retire early because I had to find an exit plan for myself. And I'm sorry to leave my colleagues in bad situations, but I wish I knew what the answer was. What do we do when the bullying comes from within?
So, Sara, I saw you nodding. I don't know if you want to add a little bit. I know you already sort of spoke to this in answer to the previous question.
Well, first, I just want to say, Pam, I'm so sorry to hear that you're personally going through that. And I'm always sorry to lose a really valued member of the profession. Like, I feel like there's a lot of good people leaving earlier than they otherwise would for similar reasons. So I'm sorry to hear you're experiencing that. I think to go back to Article 5 of the Code of Ethics and just the Code of Ethics generally, one of the things I really struggle with is that there are some internal tensions between many of these articles. And so when push comes to shove, which of these principles do we superordinate and which do we subordinate to them, right? And I also think that many of these principles can be invoked in what I would characterize as bad faith. So I am really blessed to be working in academic libraries. It is very rare that we experience challenges. But the only challenge I have experienced has been to display material. So, and not collections on display, but actually interactive displays. So community members' responses to display materials on an interactive whiteboard. And the challenge came from a colleague in the library. And they didn't directly invoke this Article 5 of the Code of Ethics, but this is essentially what they were invoking, was that the comment that was anonymously posted on the engagement board in the display in response to the display caused them harm. And so we have to balance advocating for good working conditions for our colleagues with the notion, as Caroline pointed out, that information itself cannot be harmful, especially in the context of the library. This wasn't a targeted attack that would constitute incitement to violence or harassment of an individual or doxing or anything of that nature. So it didn't rise to those levels. It wasn't even a bias incident by Penn State's standards, which I would argue brush up against First Amendment protected speech. It was something that this person just found personally offensive. And to me, that's too low of a threshold to invoke Article 5 when we have other articles in the Code of Ethics that speak to censorship and intellectual freedom and equitable service and access to our patron communities, and to participate and engage in First Amendment protected freedom of expression when we provide that outlet as part of our displays and programming. So my response is that yes, I want to provide safe and intellectually comfortable working conditions for my colleagues, but by the same token, the nature of any library, but in particular an academic library, is to provide access to works that we may find personally offensive. And it's also to provide programming and points of engagement for our patron communities that may result in the expression of ideas and viewpoints and information that we find personally offensive. And unfortunately, I kind of take a hard line on this, that if you're not able to withstand that in the course of your day-to-day duties, then maybe working in libraries is not the right choice for you.
So I skipped to the fifth principle, but we do have a question about the first principle in comparison with the ninth. So the question is, how can you reconcile the first principle, which I'll review, and the ninth within the ALA Code of Ethics? So the first principle is, we provide the highest level of service to all library users through appropriate and usefully organized resources, equitable access, and accurate, unbiased, and courteous responses to all requests. The ninth, we affirm the inherent dignity and rights of every person. We work to recognize and dismantle systemic and individual biases, to confront inequity, oppression, to enhance diversity and inclusion, and to advance racial and social justice in our libraries, communities, profession, and associations through awareness, advocacy, education, collaborative services, and allocation of resources and spaces. So this is that was a long preamble, but the ninth principle, again, I'm not a librarian, but my understanding is that's a newer principle, and how do we reconcile these two principles to provide the highest service through appropriate and usefully organized resources, equitable and access, and accurate, unbiased, and courteous responses with that new ninth principle? So can I start with Caroline?
The first principle and the ninth principle, I think that I don't see as many contradictions between those parts of the code of ethics. I see more tensions in some of the other ones. And so, for example, I mean, the second tenet of resisting any effort to censor, I think that is probably more coming into conflict with when you start saying what libraries are going to do with respect to dismantling systemic biases. I mean, not that that's not a worthy aim, but I think that when we start to get clearer on, well, what does that mean and how do we achieve that? I mean, for some people, they see that being achieved as restricting access to certain viewpoints and sources. And that you do start categorizing and classifying certain viewpoints as either in support of your goal or working against it, and therefore something that should not be accessioned. So that is where I see more of a contradiction. And then also the seventh tenet about not having our personal convictions interfere with upholding those principles. That I see this newer tenet as having more of an ideological focus to it than some of the other ones, which I think are about advocating more for general principles. And so there is more discussion and deliberation to be had, because I think that, really the tension that we talk about a lot in libraries is whether we can have intellectual freedom and social justice. And I think that that is also part of what we are trying to tease out here by looking at those tensions in the code of ethics. And I know Emily Knox has been a really vocal advocate for the fact that you can't have social justice without intellectual freedom, that censorship is antithetical to a free and open society. And so if that is what we are working towards, we have to have a very strong and clear stance against censorship, because when we start to entertain censorship as a tool in support of social justice, we're actually working against those outcomes.
So, but before I move on, I just wanted to share that. So the seventh principle is we distinguish between our personal convictions and professional duties, and do not allow our personal beliefs to interfere with fair representation of the aims of our institutions or access to information resources. So, so feel free, Sara, to respond either to a comparison with between the ninth and the first, or the ninth and the seventh.
I'm going to break the rules and go back to the ninth and the second that Caroline mentioned, only because this tension between that new ninth principle, which just was adopted in 2021, and that second principle regarding resisting efforts to censor library materials is a tension that was actually acknowledged by the group that put forward the resolution to actually add this ninth article to the Code of Ethics. So I went back to the report done by the Committee on Professional Ethics subgroup on social and racial justice. They had worked in collaboration with other ALA units. But again, there's this explicit acknowledgement that aspects of the Code of Ethics are now in conflict. So this is a quote from this report. The subgroup, which will disband after COPE's meeting at the 2021 ALA annual conference, has made some recommendations to COPE about how to proceed if the ninth principle is adopted. And again, it was. These include revision of the preamble to the ALA Code of Ethics principles to add context for the racial and social justice principle, the development of interpretations or Q&As addressing ableism and sexism, and guidance for collection development practices that balance the Code of Ethics second principle on censorship and the proposed ninth principle on social and racial justice. So what I think is interesting, and I'll borrow a concept from tabletop gaming called retcon or retroactive continuity, is what we're going to see is there's going to be an effort in ALA to retcon in this ninth principle and say we now have to tweak all of our other ethical principles in order to accommodate it. Now, again, on its face, I don't think there's a problem with the ninth principle. I do, however, personally and professionally think that some of these principles are more or less superordinate or subordinate. And we actually say in the preamble to our Code of Ethics that we have a special obligation to the free flow of information. That's how we're describing intellectual freedom. So to me, the superordinate principle is intellectual freedom. It's the resistance to censorship. It's the support for intellectual privacy, which includes freedom from interference when we're engaging with or in the processes of forming our own ideas. So anything that interferes with those principles, I think, is in conflict with the Code of Ethics. The other framing that I'll just throw out there that I hope we'll be exploring in an upcoming event with Heterodox Libraries on May 23rd, our virtual symposium, Curiosity, Controversy, and Intellectual Courage, is Dr. Sigel Ben-Porat's framing of inclusive freedom. So this was kind of a major framing of the book that we're reading for that symposium, Cancel Wars, where she says that in this case, universities, but I think it also applies to libraries, must balance this commitment to an inclusive, liberal society and social justice with the necessity of freedom of expression to those goals. And essentially what she says is we need to allow for the broadest possible freedom of expression, so any legally protected speech, right? While also acknowledging that there can be harms that arise from the exercise of free expression. We need to acknowledge those harms and do what we can to mitigate them. So I think a lot of people are not going to be satisfied with the fact that we're not preventing those harms and treating thought crime like pre-crime. But, that's what she puts forward as a potential resolution to resolve some of the tensions we see with the ninth and maybe the second principle or first principle or even seventh principle of that Code of Ethics that we've been discussing.
So Pam, I want to give you an opportunity to compare the ninth principle with any principle that you feel that you want to compare it to. And also, if you would, because I want to make sure everybody has time to a minute or so to respond to, what's your vision for the future of ALA libraries and librarians? So if you can kind of segue from any comparison with between the ninth and another principle to the future, that would be great.
Okay, well, Carolyn and Sara, their answers made me all the answers I already had, like my head is spinning now. But I do remember I did hear Emily Knox talk about intellectual freedom and social justice, and I agree absolutely. You can't have one without the other, right? They're connected, and so I think I heard something at in a webinar I watched recently. I can't even remember which one it was. I see so many, but the quote was it was John Crostra from Every Library. He said, DEI predates DEI. And I thought about this and I thought, these are issues that we have cared about for a long time. It's not that we don't care about them at all. I mean, librarians, equity is, that's been a long-standing what's the word? We care about that, right? We care about equity. We care about making sure people get access to information. It's just when we changed the conversation, people got mad, right? And I don't, I don't allow ALA to make my decisions for me. I look at the principles, I let them guide me, and if there's something that doesn't doesn't sit well with me. I let my own, mind take over, because what? I have the information. I have lots of information. I know where to find more information. And if there's information I get that contradicts something that ALA says, I'll use it. I'll use it, and I won't, I don't have a problem with that. I'll speak up about it. As far as my vision, well, I do believe that, there is a cohesiveness, that a principle that we can probably all get behind, is censorship. But people can't, there is nuance to that. There's nuance to everything, right? Nothing is binary. Nothing is binary. And so I do hope that we can find some common ground with understanding each other, and understanding why people might be challenging works, while also not just removing them without due process. And I hope there's common ground for that. And I hope that we can continue the conversation to find it.
So, Caroline, can you, what's your vision for the future?
Note for us to conclude on. And I think as much as there has been such alarming coverage and of course, all these documented incidents of challenges to libraries, I think that there's a lot to be hopeful about, because the institution has existed for almost 200 years. And the public library in that time has demonstrated itself to be a highly adaptive and innovative institution. And the same could be said for the country. There is a lot to criticize, but there is a lot to celebrate. And I think that the public library, much like Pam was just saying, needs to wrestle with the same issues that we're wrestling with as a country, that we need to be able to find ways to listen across differences, that we need to be able to also have libraries advocate for information as a public good and not as a profit center, because libraries are one of the last remaining places where people have a right to access information regardless of their ability to pay. And this is only intensified with the proliferation of digital resources. And so I would like to see libraries not only continue to advocate against censorship and the freedom to read and for intellectual freedom, but to also make that clear in the context of the broader information landscape. So it's not just about right to content, but also thinking about it across platforms and how we either enable or restrict access based on the point of access. And I would also hope that libraries and the American Library Association will again be able to recommit to these principles and to be able to establish common ground around these adherence to principles, because we will always disagree. And that is part of living in a democratic society. But if we can find ways to constructively disagree, then I think that that is a role that libraries can play, but we have to be able to model that within the profession itself.
So can I ask Sara to respond to the same question? I just want to remind anyone who's on Circle that they can type a question into the chat, and we'll have a little bit of time for that.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Yeah, I would completely be in line with Caroline and Pam's visions. I think what I would contribute is, and maybe look for a post on heterodoxy and the stacks on this in the near term, is I want to make book banning boring again. I think although we are absolutely seeing spikes in challenges to library materials and also broader censorship efforts. So FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, also has a new report out on deplatforming attempts on college campuses, which they describe as surging. With all due respect and certainly love for FIRE, for PEN America, for even the Office of Intellectual Freedom at the ALA, I do think they have a self-interest in hyperbolically describing the dynamics at play. I alluded a little bit earlier to the timing of these surges, and I think there's a couple of factors that we should keep in mind. One is the sudden onset of the transparency of what was happening in K-12 schools during remote schooling during COVID. So we saw a lot of organizing by organizations like Moms for Liberty, partially in response to what they were seeing their students being taught, right, in online school during COVID. So if you look at the timelines for what PEN America and ALA describe as these surges in library book challenges, it coincides with that time frame. Started in school libraries, migrated to public libraries, right? So that's a hypothesis I'm putting out there for consideration. Greater transparency led to greater scrutiny, led to increased challenges. I think there's also a network effect. So because folks can organize not just locally, but internationally, nationally, online, and because they can very quickly create and distribute lists of materials to put forward for, as materials of concern or reconsideration to their libraries, we're seeing kind of what I call robo banning. Like people are just submitting lists of materials, as Pam described earlier. They've never even seen the book, right? Like they don't even know if it's in the library's collection. They just want it banned because an organization that they identify with, affiliate with, belong to is suggesting that it be banned. But again, I'll go back to some of the public polling data that I cited earlier, which is that banning library materials is broadly unpopular. Censorship is broadly unpopular. The freedom of expression and First Amendment protections are extremely popular. And so I think if library workers familiarize ourselves with some de-escalation techniques, really engage with our community members' concerns about the library and our materials and our programming in good faith, work with people to find alternate materials or programming that is of interest to them, and explain that our mission is to provide the broadest possible access to our community members to a variety of viewpoints and entertainment, then I think that puts us, that helps us reclaim some ethical and moral ground in this debate. And I think if we can make book banning boring again, then I think we'll see a subsidence in the trend for it to surge and increase. So that's really my hope, is to tone down some of the rhetoric, maybe move away from some of these martial culture war, proxy war metaphors, and really basically say, acknowledge that this is happening and happening at an increasing rate. But when you look at the number of libraries, the number of people and community members that we work with, the number of books that we hold and programs that we put on and people that attend those programs, it's really an infinitesimal percentage of folks that are malcontent or items in our collection that are experiencing these challenges. And so I think that's something that we should really hold on to.
So I'm just kind of waiting to make sure that nobody has any questions. But Caroline, I remember when we met a few weeks ago, and I had said something about, I said, it's not a conspiracy. There's no conspiracy, to ban the publication of books or whatever. And Pam, you and Pam both kind of chimed in and said, well, there's, sort of pre-publication bans. And then you actually had a little bit of a I don't want to say a conspiracy, but you sort of pushed back against my comment, and I don't know if you even remember what you said, or if you wanted to share that, because I don't think you had an opportunity during our talk here today.
Sara, was talking about the pre-publication bans, and then the ways that librarians at the collection stage might opt not to add items into the collection, and that could be seen as, if not a conspiratorial effort, that there is evidence of there being this resistance to acquiring items based on their content. So when we had that conversation, I would say that this actually dovetails with what I was just saying about librarians recommitting to advocating for information, access to information as a public good and not seeing information as a profit center. It seems that advocacy has waned a bit, especially as the emphasis has shifted to other advocacy areas in librarianship around inclusion. I think that for me, one of the really important inclusion pieces and diversity pieces is thinking about sources. And of course, I don't work in a library, but I mean, my understanding of how collection development works is that it's not as though librarians have free reign to just purchase from wherever. They're working with vendors, and then the vendors are also presenting selections from which the librarians can choose and bring something into the collection. And then media concentration then is an issue for libraries, and the diversity of sources that can be acquired and made available in a collection. So yeah, I would say it's not that that there's a conspiracy to restrict access, but I think that there are converging forces that impinge on librarians' ability to access or to acquire from as many viewpoints or represent as many viewpoints as possible. So, but again, that's not a new issue. I think it's just not one that is being put in the foreground as much as it used to be. But one example that I remember, I think this came from James Danke, who was the Wisconsin Historical Society librarian for a long time, and he was known for his advocacy for building independent and alternative collections. But he told this anecdote about, I think he was visiting the Miami-Dade Public Library in the 90s, and that the Miami-Dade Library promoted itself as having really robust, diverse newspaper collections. But he said that in the library itself, it was very mainstream in its newspaper collection. And then he went across the street to, I think, a newsstand, and he saw all of these independent African-American and Haitian-American papers that were not at all collected by the library, and they were right across the street for sale. But because presumably the vendors that a library system, and certainly a very large one such as Miami-Dade, is working with, they don't have that access like we would if you had more of this flexibility and purchasing options. So I think that's just another way to think about that situation of how representation can get narrowed or constrained. And it's not necessarily because a librarian is looking for a reason not to acquire something. It's that what they even have to choose from in the first place might have already been restricted for them.
So one other, again, I don't think there's going to be any questions, but we did have another, and I'll turn this over to Pam. Groups like Moms for Liberty believe that they're holding libraries accountable, and we have sort of talked about a little bit about accountability, within the library and within the American Library Association. But this would be, sort of communities, genuinely believing that they're trying to hold libraries accountable for how they spend, taxpayer dollars or whatever. And, libraries say that they want to hear, that they need to hear from their community. They want to, and they need to hear from their community, about all things, collections, community programs, all of this. So what are some ways that that community members can hold libraries accountable and interact with libraries and librarians in ways that are productive and respond, and how can libraries respond appropriately to that? And I'll give Pam a chance, and then we'll finish up with Sara. And if nobody types in any questions, we'll end it there.
So I'll just go back to my my vision, what I hope would happen, is that we'll start listening to each other, right? And this is part of, we've talked about culture wars. I mean, that's part of what's going on is people just aren't listening to each other. And libraries are the place where we should be able to have these conversations. We should be able, we should have a variety of information so that people can, I think that's a safe way to get information, is to read it in a book. That's a safe way to get scary information. And that, I was really sorry to hear about the case where because the librarian said, we need to have more viewpoint diversity, she was fired. I mean, that's exactly what the library should be doing. And so, the library, I think libraries can provide forums. And I know it's difficult because people want to just shout each other down. It seems to be the way to do it. And I'm talking about both sides of it, left and right, think that that's an appropriate way to show your displeasure about anybody else's opinion, is to shout them down. Some people, will even say violence is an appropriate response. And I hope we can move away from that. But I do think that libraries are a place where those conversations can happen. And I had one other thought that it's gone out of my head. But I always try to think about where we can find common ground, right? Where can we find common ground? And I think, I disagree with Moms for Liberty, but I think, if I sat down with someone from that group, we might discover that, yeah, we both actually do care about kids, and we care about our community, and how can we build from there?
So, Sara, I'd like to give you the last word. Unless somebody types in a question, you can wrap us up.
That's so kind. Thank you. I'll pick right up where Pam left off, because I got curious about Moms for Liberty we've been hearing about them for a while, but I also saw them in our agenda for the discussion today. So I looked them up, and one point of potential agreement I have with them is they have some really interesting guidance on privacy in schools. Something I've written about is the failure of FERPA to effectively protect student privacy in the digital transformation of higher education, and how FERPA allows what are essentially ad tech companies to also become school officials when they're providing services or platforms on behalf of educational institutions. So I was like, okay, this is something we could actually have a conversation about, right? Is our interest in privacy. But setting that aside, to the broader question of accountability of libraries to their publics and how to effectively engage with your library as a community member, the first thing I would say is be a library user, right? Show up. I really believe in good faith that there's something in the library for everyone. And if in fact you find that there isn't, there are some steps that you can take to ensure that that's the case. I would say most, if not all, libraries have a suggestion form. Most, if not all, libraries provide some means for booking library spaces for programming and events, and outline a policy for doing that. So again, if programming in your library is not to your interest, suggest programming, bring in a speaker, provide programming, right? Suggest materials for purchase if you're not finding reading material or online material that's of interest to you. And then the last thing was be informed about the governance of your library. So what are board meetings like? How is the board composed? How, are people elected or appointed? What's the scope of their responsibility? In generally speaking, there's going to be at least portions of regular board meetings that are open to the public and that will have open time on the agenda for public comment. So that's a way to get involved. But I would recommend the process of, again, first becoming an active library user. So go looking for the things of interest the library can provide to you, rather than worrying about the things they're providing access to that you don't want, because that's there for someone else and it's none of your business, right? And then also becoming informed about library governance. I hope that these will de-escalate some of the rhetoric and the tension and the reactionary responses to what libraries are trying to do in their communities. I find that when we attend to the nuance and attend to frankly, reality that generally speaking, libraries are doing their best and they're doing really good work. And when we can make suggestions to the alternative, like, hey, do you realize you don't have these authors, or you don't have this perspective on this contemporary issue, or, you know, this person is standing for national election and you don't have their book in the collection, could you add it? Or I'll donate it. Can you add it, right? Libraries should be receptive to that. And the other process and point of engagement that libraries have is some form of requesting reconsideration of material. I don't personally advocate challenging or banning materials, but one avenue of discussion I think we need to leave open is whether a material should be placed in something like a children's library or children's collection versus placed in a YA or adult collection, right? So that's something where you can say, you know, I've looked at this material. These are the areas of concern that I have. Maybe here is some additional literature on the potential impact this could have on child development. I suggest that you move this into the YA or the adult collection, right? So just, you know, some ways that you could engage with the library, again, in good faith, with a fully informed perspective on how libraries work, what they have to offer you, and then again, how they can be responsive to concerns you have about, frankly, the way you're being served, but also in many cases, the way that your taxpayer resources are being allocated.
I want to thank you all so much for doing this. And although we're, 2 weeks late now, happy Library Week. And thank you so much for giving your time for this panel and this very important topic.